The autumn rain drummed against the windows of Peterson's gun and tactical shop as Sarah Martinez pulled her worn Honda Civic into the parking lot. At 19, she looked even younger than her age, with her petite frame barely reaching 5 feet 3 inches and a face that still carried the softness of adolescence. Her oversized army surplus jacket hung loose on her shoulders, making her appear almost childlike as she hurried through the drizzle toward the shop's heavy glass door. The bell above the entrance chimed as Sarah stepped inside, immediately hit by the familiar smell of gun oil and leather. The shop was busier than usual for a Tuesday afternoon. Several men in their 30s and 40s browsed the displays, their conversations mixing hunting stories with discussions about home defense. Behind the long glass counter, 2 employees moved efficiently between customers, their voices professional and knowledgeable. Sarah made her way to the handgun display, her sneakers squeaking softly on the polished concrete floor. She had saved every penny from her part-time job at the local diner for 6 months, working double shifts and skipping meals to afford what she needed. Living alone in a studio apartment on the rough side of town had taught her hard lessons about safety, especially after the break-in attempt 3 weeks ago. "Can I help you find something?" The voice belonged to Jake, a stocky man in his mid-30s with calloused hands and a skeptical expression. His tone was polite, but carried an undertone that suggested he doubted she had any business being there. "I'm looking for a handgun for home protection," Sarah replied quietly, her voice barely audible over the shop's background noise. She had practiced this moment in her mirror at home, knowing she would need to project confidence despite her appearance. Jake's eyebrows rose slightly, and she caught him exchanging a quick glance with his coworker, Marcus, who was helping another customer nearby. "Home protection, huh? How old are you, sweetheart?" 19, Sarah answered, straightening her shoulders. "I have my license, and I've completed the safety course." 19, Jake repeated with a slight chuckle. "And you think you need a gun? What's the matter, boyfriend troubles?" The question stung, but Sarah kept her composure. She had expected this kind of response. "No boyfriend troubles. I live alone, and there was an attempted break-in at my apartment complex last month. The police said response time to my area averages 12 minutes. Marcus, a tall man with graying temples, finished with his customer and wandered over. 12 minutes is a long time when someone's trying to get through your door, he said. But his tone suggested he was humoring her rather than taking her seriously. "You sure you wouldn't be better off with a good deadbolt and maybe a dog?" "I'm allergic to dogs," Sarah replied, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. "And I already have 3 deadbolts. Look, I just want to see some options for home defense handguns. I have cash, and I'm legally allowed to purchase." Jake leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "Cash, huh? Let me guess, Daddy gave you his credit card and told you to buy something pretty." The assumption made Sarah's jaw clench. Her father had died when she was 16, leaving her mother to struggle with medical bills before cancer took her too. Sarah had been on her own since graduating high school, working 60-hour weeks just to survive. The money in her purse represented months of sacrifice. "I earned this money myself," she said firmly. "I work at Murphy's Diner downtown. 60 hours a week for the past 6 months. "Murphy's Diner?" Marcus snorted. "That rough place by the interstate? What do you do there, hostess?" "Server, cook, dishwasher, whatever they need," Sarah replied, her voice growing stronger despite her embarrassment. "I've been there since I was 17. The 2 men exchanged another look, this one more openly amused. Jake shook his head slowly. "Look, kid, I appreciate that you're trying to be responsible and all, but handling a firearm isn't like serving coffee. These things are serious business. Maybe you should start with pepper spray or something more your speed." "I've had firearms training," Sarah insisted. "I grew up around guns. My grandfather taught me to shoot when I was 12. "Your grandfather, right?" Marcus said with obvious skepticism. "Let me guess, he was some kind of war hero who filled your head with stories about being tough?" Sarah felt her hands tremble slightly, but not from fear or nervousness. It was anger. "My grandfather served 3 tours in Vietnam as a Marine Corps sniper. He taught me that firearms demand respect and proper training, both of which I have." "Vietnam," Jake said with a theatrical whistle. "That explains the attitude. Look, sweetheart, times have changed since your granddad's war stories. Modern firearms require a different kind of person to handle them properly. What kind of person? Sarah asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. Someone with the physical and mental capability to handle high-stress situations, Marcus explained condescendingly. No offense, but you look like a strong breeze could knock you over. In a real emergency, you'd probably end up shooting yourself or some innocent bystander. Other customers in the shop had begun to notice the conversation. Sarah could feel their eyes on her, some curious, others dismissive. A few men near the rifle display were openly smirking as they pretended to examine scopes. Size doesn't determine capability, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the flush spreading across her face. And I'm not asking for your opinion on my physical abilities. I'm asking to see handguns suitable for home defense. Jake sighed dramatically. Okay. Tell you what. Since you're so determined, let me show you something that might work for someone your size. He reached into the display case and pulled out a small pink-handled revolver. This little lady is perfect for someone like you. It's chambered in .22, so the recoil won't knock you on your butt, and the pink handle ensures you won't confuse it with your boyfriend's gun. Sarah stared at the weapon in disbelief. I don't want a pink gun. I want something effective for home defense. A .22 isn't adequate for stopping a determined intruder. Listen to this. Marcus called out to his co-worker, loud enough for nearby customers to hear. She thinks she knows about stopping power. What's next? Asking about hollow points and muzzle velocity. Actually, yes, Sarah replied without missing a beat. I want to know about ammunition options, muzzle velocity, and stopping power. I want to understand barrel length versus concealability trade-offs, and I want to discuss different action types. The shop fell noticeably quieter as her words carried across the space. Jake and Marcus stared at her with expressions somewhere between surprise and annoyance. Okay, Miss Expert, Jake said, his tone turning sharper. Since you know so much, what do you think about a Glock 19? 9mm, 15-round capacity standard, striker-fired action, approximately 4-inch barrel, Sarah recited. Good balance between concealability and effectiveness, widely used by law enforcement, reliable reputation, moderate recoil manageable for smaller-framed shooters with proper technique. Marcus blinked several times. Lucky guess. What about a Smith & Wesson Model 642? 5-shot snub-nose revolver, 357 Magnum capable, but typically loaded with 38 special for reduced recoil, Sarah continued. Hammerless design prevents snags, simple operation under stress, but limited capacity and longer trigger pull. Good backup weapon, but not ideal as primary home defense due to capacity limitations. Jake's smirk faded slightly, but his attitude remained dismissive. All right, so you memorized some specifications. That doesn't mean you can actually handle these weapons. Knowing numbers isn't the same as being able to shoot straight when your life depends on it. Then, let me demonstrate, Sarah said quietly. Do you have a range here? We do, Marcus replied slowly. But it's for serious customers only. I'm a serious customer. I have $800 cash and valid identification. I want to test fire potential purchases before making a decision. The two employees looked at each other uncertainly. Several customers had stopped their browsing entirely, now openly listening to the conversation. The tension in the shop was becoming palpable. $800? Jake asked skeptically. You're telling me a 19-year-old diner waitress has $800 cash for a gun purchase? Waitress, cook, dishwasher, and weekend prep, Sarah corrected. And, yes, I have $800. I can show you if necessary. Before either employee could respond, an older customer near the ammunition display spoke up. Just let the girl shoot, for crying out loud. If she can't handle it, she'll figure that out real quick. This isn't a game, Earl, Marcus replied sharply. We have liability issues to consider. What liability? Earl shot back. She says she's trained, she's got the money, and she's legal age. You discriminating against customers now? Jake's face reddened. We're not discriminating. We're being responsible. There's a difference between discrimination and using common sense. Common sense like assuming someone can't handle a firearm based on how they look? Sarah asked pointedly. Based on experience, Marcus corrected. In 15 years in this business, I've seen plenty of people who thought they could handle firearms find out the hard way they were wrong. And how many of those people were young women? Sarah pressed. The question hung in the air for a moment before Jake answered. Look, it's not about being a woman. It's about being realistic about your limitations. My limitations, Sarah repeated slowly. Such as the fact that you weigh what, 100 pounds? Such as the fact that you've probably never been in a real violent situation. Such as the fact that when push comes to shove, you'd probably freeze up or start crying. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, but she forced herself to remain calm. You're making assumptions about me based on absolutely no evidence. I'm making observations based on 15 years of experience, Jake retorted. Your experience doesn't include knowing anything about my background, Sarah replied, her voice growing colder. What background? Marcus asked with obvious skepticism. What could a 19-year-old possibly have experienced that would prepare her for life-or-death situations? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring at the two men who had spent the better part of 10 minutes belittling and dismissing her. She thought about walking out, going to another shop, trying to find someone who would treat her with basic human dignity. But something about their smugness, their absolute certainty that they knew who she was and what she was capable of, made her dig in her heels. You want to know about my background? She asked quietly. Sure, Jake said with a dismissive wave. Enlighten us. Sarah reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a thin leather wallet. From it, she extracted a worn military identification card and placed it on the counter between them. Jake picked it up, glanced at it, and his expression immediately changed. This is fake, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Check the numbers, Sarah replied calmly. Call the verification line if you want. Marcus leaned over to look at the ID, his eyes widening as he read. This says you're active duty National Guard. Correct. Military police, Jake read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. Correct again. The shop had gone completely silent now. Every customer and employee was focused on the small young woman standing calmly at the counter, watching two grown men realize how badly they had misjudged the situation. You're telling us you're a military police officer? Marcus asked, his earlier smugness completely evaporated. I'm telling you I've been serving in the National Guard for 2 years. I completed basic training at Fort Leonard Wood, advanced individual training at Fort Gordon, and I'm currently assigned to the 142nd Military Police Company out of the State Armory. Jake set the ID down carefully, as if it might explode. But you look so young, small, female, Sarah supplied. Yes, I'm all of those things. I'm also qualified expert marksman with the M9 pistol, the M4 carbine, and the M249 squad automatic weapon. I've completed combat lifesaver training, defensive tactics training, and I'm certified in non-lethal weapons including pepper spray, batons, and tasers. The two employees stood frozen, staring at her with expressions of growing horror as they realized the magnitude of their mistake. I've served weekend duty for 2 years, Sarah continued in the same calm tone, which means I've missed countless social events, dates, and normal teenage experiences to train with my unit. I've sacrificed time I could have spent making friends or having fun because I believe in serving my community and my country. Marcus opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. I work 60 hours a week at Murphy's Diner to pay for my apartment, my car, and my college classes because my GI Bill benefits won't kick in until I complete my initial enlistment period. I've saved $800 by eating ramen noodles for dinner and walking to work when my car needed repairs I couldn't afford. Jake was now visibly sweating. Look, we didn't know. You didn't know because you didn't ask, Sarah cut him off. You saw a small young woman and immediately decided I was some helpless little girl who needed to be protected from big, scary guns. You assumed I was spending daddy's money on a whim. You assumed I had no training, no experience, and no legitimate need for self-defense. She picked up her military ID and slipped it back into her wallet. You assumed all of that based on nothing but your own prejudices. The silence in the shop was deafening. Several customers were looking anywhere but at the scene unfolding at the counter. Others were watching with obvious fascination as two experienced gun shop employees were systematically dismantled by someone they had dismissed as a child. Ma'am, Jake began, his entire demeanor changed. We sincerely apologize. We made some very inappropriate assumptions, and we were completely out of line. Yes, you were, Sarah agreed. But your apology doesn't change the fact that this is how you treat customers who don't fit your preconceived notions of who belongs in a gun shop. Marcus cleared his throat nervously. If you'd still like to see some options for home defense, we'd be happy to show you our full selection. Would you? Sarah asked. 5 minutes ago, you wanted to sell me a pink 22 and suggested I get a dog instead. Now you want to show me your full selection. What changed? We learned about your background, Jake admitted quietly. So you only treat customers with respect if they can prove they deserve it by meeting your arbitrary standards? The question hung in the air like an accusation, which was exactly what it was. Both employees looked deeply uncomfortable, shifting their weight and avoiding eye contact with not just Sarah, but the other customers who were witnessing their humiliation. Look, Marcus said finally, we deal with a lot of people who come in here without proper training or realistic expectations. Sometimes we get a little protective about making sure firearms end up in the right hands. Protective, Sarah repeated. Is that what you call it when you mock a customer's appearance, make assumptions about their financial situation, and refuse to take their needs seriously? No, Jake said quietly. That's not protective. That's just being jerks. Sarah nodded slowly. At least you're honest about that much. The front door chimed again as another customer entered, but the newcomer stopped just inside the entrance, clearly sensing the tension in the room. The rain was picking up outside, drumming harder against the windows and adding to the oppressive atmosphere. I'm still interested in purchasing a handgun for home defense, Sarah said after a long moment. But I'm wondering if I should take my business somewhere else. Please, Marcus said quickly. Let us make this right. We were completely wrong, and we want to help you find exactly what you need. Sarah studied their faces, seeing genuine remorse mixed with professional concern about losing a sale. If I stay, I want to be treated exactly like you would treat any other qualified customer. No condescension, no assumptions, and no special treatment because you now know my background. Absolutely, Jake agreed immediately. And I want access to your range to test fire any weapon I'm considering purchasing. Of course. Sarah looked around the shop, noting that every other customer was still watching the drama unfold. She realized that her next decision would not only affect her own experience, but potentially send a message about how businesses like this should treat all their customers. The weight of that responsibility settled on her shoulders as she considered her options. Walk away and take her business elsewhere, making a statement about accepting poor treatment, or stay and demand the respect she deserved from the beginning. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance as the storm intensified, and Sarah Martinez stood at a crossroads that would define not just her afternoon, but her understanding of how she would allow herself to be treated in a world that often judged books by their covers. Sarah made her decision. She would stay, but only on her terms. The lesson these two employees needed to learn was more important than her personal comfort, and walking away would only enable their behavior with the next young woman who walked through their door. All right, she said firmly. I'll give you one chance to make this right. But understand that I expect professional service from this point forward. Relief flooded both men's faces. Thank you, Jake said. What specific type of handgun were you looking for? Something reliable for home defense, medium to full frame, 9mm or larger caliber, with good capacity and proven reliability record, Sarah replied, her voice taking on a more businesslike tone. I want something I can depend on, not something pretty. Marcus nodded quickly. Absolutely. Let me show you some options that would fit those requirements. He moved to a different section of the display case, pulling out several handguns and placing them on a padded mat on the counter. This is the Glock 19 you mentioned earlier. Here's a Smith & Wesson M&P9, and this is a Springfield XD9. Sarah examined each weapon carefully, checking the action, testing the grip, and evaluating the sight picture. Her movements were confident and practiced, the result of countless hours of training with her National Guard unit. The Glock has good ergonomics for my hand size, she observed, but I'd like to try the others as well. What's your range policy? We charge $15 for range time, which includes targets and basic eye and ear protection, Jake explained, his tone now completely professional. We'll provide the ammunition for testing, and if you purchase a firearm today, we'll deduct the range fee from your total. That's fair, Sarah nodded. I'd like to test all three. As Marcus gathered the necessary paperwork for range use, several customers began approaching Sarah. The first was Earl, the older man who had spoken up during the confrontation. Miss, he said quietly, I want you to know that not everyone in here agreed with how those boys treated you. That was wrong, plain and simple. Thank you, Sarah replied. I appreciate you speaking up. A woman in her 40s who had been browsing with her husband joined the conversation. I've been shopping for a handgun for months, she said, and I've gotten similar treatment at 2 other shops. Thank you for standing your ground. We all deserve respect, Sarah said simply, regardless of what we look like or how old we are. Word of the confrontation was spreading through the shop as customers quietly shared what they had witnessed. Some looked embarrassed, as if they were personally responsible for the employee's behavior. Others nodded approvingly at Sarah, clearly impressed by how she had handled herself. Range is ready when you are, Marcus announced, returning with safety equipment and ammunition. Sarah followed him toward the back of the shop, past displays of hunting gear and tactical equipment. The range was small but well-maintained, with 3 shooting lanes and proper ventilation. Marcus handed her safety glasses and hearing protection, then loaded magazines for each of the 3 handguns. Start with whichever one you prefer, he said. Take your time and fire as many rounds as you need to get a feel for each one. Sarah selected the Glock first, checking it carefully before loading and taking her position at the firing line. The familiar weight and balance felt good in her hands as she aligned the sights on the target 15 yards downrange. The first shot surprised Marcus with its precision. Instead of the wild shot he had apparently expected, the bullet struck the target dead center in the scoring rings. Sarah fired 4 more rounds in quick succession, creating a tight group that any experienced shooter would be proud of. Good shooting, Marcus admitted, unable to hide his surprise. Very good. Sarah switched to the Smith & Wesson, again taking time to familiarize herself with the weapon before firing. Her group with the second handgun was equally impressive, though she noted that the grip angle felt slightly different in her hands. The Springfield XD produced similar results, confirming what Marcus was beginning to understand. This young woman was not only competent with firearms, she was genuinely skilled. Have you given any thought to which one you prefer? He asked as Sarah removed her hearing protection. The Glock feels most natural in my hands, she replied. But I want to try them with defensive ammunition, not just target loads. Marcus nodded, impressed despite himself. Most customers never thought about the difference between target and defensive ammunition, let alone requested to test both. We have hollow points available. Spear Gold Dot and Federal HSD are our most popular defensive loads. Let's try the Federal HSD in all 3, Sarah decided. As they loaded the more expensive ammunition, Marcus found himself reassessing everything he had assumed about his customer. Her knowledge was clearly extensive, her shooting skills were exceptional, and her approach to the purchase was more thorough than most law enforcement officers he served. The defensive ammunition confirmed Sarah's preference for the Glock. While all 3 handguns performed well, she was consistently more accurate and faster with the Austrian pistol. I think I've made my decision, she announced after the final string of shots. They returned to the main shop area, where a small crowd had gathered around the counter. Word of Sarah's range performance had spread, and several customers were curious about the young woman who had both verbally and literally shot down the employee's assumptions. I'll take the Glock 19, Sarah told Jake, who was waiting behind the counter with the necessary paperwork already prepared. Excellent choice, he replied, his tone respectful and professional. Would you like to look at holsters and accessories? Yes, I'll need a good holster for home use. Something secure, but accessible. Jake showed her several options, explaining the advantages of each design without the condescending tone he had used earlier. Sarah selected a simple but high-quality leather holster that would secure the handgun while keeping it readily accessible. What about ammunition? Jake asked. 2 boxes of the Federal HSD for defensive use, and 5 boxes of target ammunition for practice, Sarah decided without hesitation. As Jake calculated her total, Sarah became aware that most of the shop was watching the transaction. She realized that her experience had become something of a teaching moment, not just for the employees who had misjudged her, but for other customers who had witnessed the entire confrontation. Your total is $743.62, Jake announced. Sarah counted out the cash, mostly 20s and 10s that represented weeks of double shifts and careful budgeting. As she handed over the money, she noticed that Jake's hands were slightly trembling. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I need to apologize again. Not just for the assumption and the disrespect, but for the way it must have made you feel. You deserve better than that from anyone, but especially from someone in a position to help you." Sarah studied his face, seeing what appeared to be genuine remorse. "Apology accepted," she said. "But I hope you remember this the next time a young woman walks into your shop." "I will," Jake promised. "We both will." Marcus nodded emphatically. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, how did you get so proficient with firearms at such a young age?" Sarah considered the question as Jake completed her paperwork. "My grandfather started teaching me when I was 12, she began. He was a Marine, like I mentioned, and he believed that if someone was going to be around firearms, they needed to understand them completely." She paused as memories of those early lessons flooded back. "He taught me that firearms are tools, nothing more and nothing less. They deserve respect, but not fear. He also taught me that the most important part of shooting isn't the gun, it's the person holding it." "Sounds like a wise man," Marcus observed. "He was," Sarah agreed. "He also taught me that people will underestimate you based on appearances, and that it's up to you to decide how to respond when they do." Jake winced at the obvious reference to his earlier behavior. "What did he tell you about responding?" Sarah smiled for the first time since entering the shop. "He said that sometimes the best response is to quietly prove them wrong, and sometimes the best response is to make sure they never underestimate anyone else the same way." "Which approach did you take with us?" Marcus asked. "Both," Sarah replied simply. As Jake handed her the completed paperwork and receipt, Sarah noticed that several other customers were still listening to the conversation. An older woman approached the counter, her expression thoughtful. "Excuse me, dear," the woman said. "I couldn't help but overhear. I'm Margaret Peterson, and my late husband owned this shop." Sarah looked surprised. "Mrs. Peterson? I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you. Harold passed last year, but he would have been proud of how you handled yourself today. He always said that respect should be the first thing offered to every customer, regardless of who they appeared to be." Jake and Marcus both looked uncomfortable as Mrs. Peterson continued. "I still own this shop, though I let these boys run it day to day. I think perhaps Harold's lessons need to be reinforced with some additional training." "Mrs. Peterson," Jake began, but she held up a hand to stop him. "We'll discuss this later," she said firmly before turning back to Sarah. "Young lady, I hope this experience won't discourage you from supporting local businesses. Most of us try to do better than what you experienced today." "I believe that," Sarah replied. "And I hope today will help make future experiences better for everyone." As Sarah gathered her purchases and prepared to leave, Earl approached one final time. "Miss, can I ask you something?" "Of course. What made you decide to serve in the military?" Sarah considered the question seriously. "Several things. I wanted to serve my community and my country. I wanted training and education opportunities that I couldn't afford otherwise. And, honestly, I wanted to prove to myself that I was capable of more than people assumed." "Sounds like you've succeeded on all counts," Earl observed. "I'm working on it," Sarah replied with a slight smile. As she headed toward the door, Sarah reflected on the afternoon's events. What had begun as a simple shopping trip had turned into something much more significant. She had faced down prejudice and assumptions, demonstrated her capabilities, and hopefully opened some minds in the process. The rain had lessened to a light drizzle as Sarah loaded her purchases into her car. She sat behind the wheel for a moment, processing everything that had happened. The anger she had felt was fading, replaced by a sense of satisfaction. She had handled herself well, maintained her dignity, and perhaps made things a little easier for the next young woman who walked into Peterson's gun shop. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her National Guard unit leader, reminding her about weekend drill. Sarah smiled as she read it, thinking about how Jake and Marcus would react if they knew that in addition to her military police training, she was also qualified as a combat lifesaver and had recently completed additional training in close-quarters combat. But that was information for another day. Today had been about proving a simple point, that appearances can be deceiving, that respect should be freely given until someone proves they don't deserve it, and that sometimes standing your ground is the most important thing you can do. As Sarah drove home through the drizzle, she thought about her grandfather and the lessons he had taught her about firearms, respect, and human nature. She wished he could have seen how she had applied those lessons today. Somehow, she thought he would have been proud. The Glock 19 sat securely in its new holster on the passenger seat beside her, a tool that would help her protect herself in her rough neighborhood. But, more than that, it represented a victory over assumptions and prejudice, a reminder that sometimes the smallest person in the room can be the most formidable. Back at Peterson's gun shop, the afternoon had taken on a subdued tone. Customers were still discussing what they had witnessed, and Jake and Marcus were clearly shaken by their encounter with someone who had so thoroughly challenged their preconceptions. Mrs. Peterson remained in the shop, observing her employees and considering what changes might be needed to ensure that every customer received the respect they deserved from the moment they walked through the door. The lesson of the day was clear: never judge a book by its cover, especially when that book might be written by someone who has dedicated themselves to serving others and protecting their community. Sometimes the most dangerous assumption is that someone is harmless, and sometimes the smallest package contains the greatest strength. 3 weeks later, Sarah Martinez returned to Peterson's gun and tactical shop, but this time she wasn't alone. The bell chimed as she entered with 2 other young women, both appearing to be around her age, and both looking nervous as they approached the same counter where Sarah had faced down Jake and Marcus weeks earlier. "Hi, Sarah," Jake said immediately, his tone respectful and professional. "Good to see you again. How's the Glock working out for you?" "Very well, thank you," Sarah replied. "I'm here with some friends who are interested in firearms training and possibly purchasing handguns for self-defense." The 2 women with Sarah looked surprised at Jake's friendly greeting. They had been prepared for the kind of treatment Sarah had described from her previous visit, but instead found themselves being welcomed warmly. "I'm Jake," he said, extending his hand to each of Sarah's companions. "And this is Marcus. We're here to help you find exactly what you need." "This is Jennifer," Sarah said, indicating a tall redhead with nervous energy. "And this is Michelle." Michelle was petite like Sarah, with dark hair and cautious eyes that suggested she had heard detailed accounts of Sarah's previous experience. "Nice to meet you both," Marcus said sincerely. "What brings you in today?" Jennifer glanced at Sarah before answering. "We live in the same apartment complex as Sarah. After what happened to her, and after seeing how prepared she is now, we realized we need to take our safety more seriously." "What happened to Sarah?" Jake asked with concern, looking between the 3 women. Sarah's expression grew serious. 2 weeks ago, someone tried to break into my apartment again. This time I was home." The shop grew quiet as other customers and employees tuned into the conversation. Marcus set down the inventory clipboard he had been holding, giving Sarah his full attention. "What happened?" he asked. "I was studying for midterms around midnight when I heard someone trying to force my door," Sarah began, her voice steady but carrying weight. "The deadbolts held, but I could hear him working on them with some kind of tool." Jennifer shuddered. "Tell them what you did," Sarah continued. "I called 911 first, then retrieved my Glock and took position where I could see the door but had cover from my kitchen counter. I announced loudly that I was armed and that police were on the way." "Did he leave?" Jake asked. "No. He actually got through the first deadbolt and was working on the second when I racked the slide on the Glock." "That sound is pretty distinctive." Marcus nodded knowingly. "What happened then?" "The scraping sound stopped immediately. I heard running footsteps down the hallway, and by the time police arrived 8 minutes later, he was long gone." "Jesus," Jake breathed. "Did they catch him?" "No, but they found his tools on the stairs. Pry bar and some kind of electronic lockpick. Detectives said he was probably targeting apartments with single young women, looking for easy money or worse." Michelle spoke up for the first time, her voice barely above a whisper. "After we heard what happened, Jennifer and I realized how helpless we would have been in the same situation. That's why we're here," Jennifer added with more confidence. "Sarah has been teaching us basic safety awareness, but we need proper training and protection." Mrs. Peterson emerged from the office in the back of the shop, having overheard the conversation. "Ladies," she said warmly, "I'm Margaret Peterson. I'm so sorry about your experience, Sarah, but I'm proud of how you handled it." "Thank you, ma'am. Your husband's shop provided exactly what I needed." Mrs. Peterson smiled sadly. Harold would have been pleased to hear that. "Now, what can we do for your friends?" Jake stepped forward. "With your permission, I'd like to start by asking Jennifer and Michelle about their experience with firearms, then recommend some training options before we even discuss purchasing." Sarah looked surprised and pleased. "That sounds like a much better approach than I received 3 weeks ago." Jake had the grace to look embarrassed. "We've learned a lot since then. Mrs. Peterson has implemented some new customer service protocols, and we've had additional training on unconscious bias and assumption making." "Really?" Sarah asked, intrigued. "Really," Marcus confirmed. "Turns out our experience with you wasn't isolated." Mrs. Peterson did some research and found that we've been losing potential customers for years because of our attitudes toward young people, women, and anyone who didn't look like our idea of a typical gun owner. Mrs. Peterson nodded. "Harold always said that the Second Amendment doesn't have age, gender, or appearance requirements. It took a 19-year-old soldier to remind us of that truth." Jennifer looked between Sarah and the employees with confusion. "What happened 3 weeks ago?" Sarah gave her a brief summary of her first visit, watching as both friends' expressions changed from confusion to anger to understanding. "They treated you like that?" Michelle asked incredulously. "They did," Sarah confirmed. "But they learned from it, and apparently so has the shop." Jake cleared his throat. "Ladies, if you're comfortable sharing, could you tell us about your current experience with firearms?" Jennifer answered first. "None. I've never even held a real gun. My family was always anti-gun, but recent events have changed my perspective on personal protection." "And you, Michelle?" "I shot a .22 rifle at summer camp when I was 14, but that's it. I don't know anything about handguns or self-defense." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "Okay, here's what I'd recommend. Before anyone purchases anything, you should both complete a basic firearms safety course and preferably a women's self-defense shooting course. We partner with several instructors who specialize in training new shooters." "How long would that take?" Jennifer asked. "The basic safety course is 4 hours, usually offered on Saturday mornings. The women's self-defense course is 8 hours, typically spread over 2 Saturdays." Sarah looked impressed. "That's much more thorough than what I was offered." "We've learned that proper training is the foundation of responsible ownership," Jake explained. "We'd rather delay a sale and ensure our customers are properly prepared than sell someone a firearm they can't use safely and effectively." Mrs. Peterson added, "We're also offering a discount program for women who complete both courses before purchasing. 10% off the firearm and accessories." "That's generous," Sarah observed. "It's good business," Mrs. Peterson replied. "Trained customers are safer customers, and safer customers are repeat customers who refer their friends." An older man browsing nearby ammunition approached the group. "Excuse me, but I couldn't help overhearing about your break-in attempt," he said to Sarah. "I'm Detective Ray Coleman, retired. I wanted to tell you that you handled that situation perfectly." "Thank you," Sarah replied. "My grandfather's training and my National Guard experience helped." Detective Coleman nodded approvingly. "Most people panic in situations like that. The fact that you called for help first, took a defensive position, and used verbal commands shows excellent judgment." He turned to Jennifer and Michelle. "Ladies, your friend likely prevented a serious crime that night. Home invaders who work past multiple deadbolts and continue after warnings usually have violent intentions." The weight of his words settled over the group, emphasizing the serious nature of the situation that had brought them all together. "Detective Coleman," Mrs. Peterson said, "would you be willing to speak to our women's self-defense shooting class about home invasion scenarios and proper response protocols?" "Absolutely," he replied immediately. "Too many people, especially women, don't understand the realities of violent crime and the legal aspects of self-defense." Sarah smiled. "It sounds like this shop has changed quite a bit in 3 weeks." "For the better, I hope," Jake said earnestly. "Definitely for the better," Sarah confirmed. Jennifer raised her hand tentatively. "Can I ask a potentially stupid question?" "No such thing," Marcus assured her. "How do you balance being prepared for violence with not living in fear? I mean, After what happened to Sarah, I'm scared all the time. Detective Coleman answered thoughtfully. Fear is normal and healthy when it motivates you to take reasonable precautions. The goal isn't to eliminate fear, but to replace helpless fear with confident preparedness. Exactly, Sarah agreed. Before I got proper training and equipment, every sound at night made me panic. Now I'm alert, but confident. I know what I would do if faced with a threat. Michelle nodded slowly. That's what I want. I don't want to be helpless. You won't be, Marcus promised. But it starts with proper training, not just buying a gun. Mrs. Peterson consulted a calendar behind the counter. Our next women's self-defense shooting course starts this Saturday. We have 3 spots available. 3 spots? Jennifer asked. I'd like to take the course too, Sarah explained. I have basic military training, but I'd like to learn more about civilian self-defense scenarios and legal considerations. That's smart, Detective Coleman observed. Military and civilian self-defense have different rules and objectives. Sign us all up, Jennifer decided quickly, looking to Michelle for confirmation. Definitely, Michelle agreed. As Jake processed their course registrations, word of the conversation had spread throughout the shop. Several female customers approached to ask about the women's self-defense course, expressing interest in joining future sessions. This is exactly what Harold envisioned, Mrs. Peterson murmured to Sarah. A shop that serves the community by empowering people to protect themselves responsibly. Sarah looked around at the growing group of women discussing training options and mutual support. He would have been proud. The front door chimed again, and a young man in military fatigues entered the shop. He looked around uncertainly before approaching the counter. Excuse me, he said to Jake. I'm looking for Sarah Martinez. Someone at the armory said she might be here. That's me, Sarah replied, turning toward the newcomer. You look familiar. Are you with the 142nd? Yes, ma'am. Specialist Johnson. Sergeant Miller sent me to find you. We have a situation at the armory that requires MP response. Sarah's demeanor immediately became more serious and professional. What kind of situation? Domestic disturbance involving one of our soldiers and his civilian wife. He's barricaded himself in family housing, and local police requested military police assistance since he's active duty. Sarah nodded crisply. I need to get my gear and respond immediately. She turned to Jennifer and Michelle. I have to go. Jake and Marcus will take good care of you. I'll see you both Saturday for the training course. Be careful, Jennifer said with concern. Always am, Sarah replied with a confident smile. As Sarah headed for the door, Mrs. Peterson called out to her. Sarah, thank you for everything you've taught us. Sarah paused at the entrance. Thank you for being willing to learn. She disappeared into the drizzle, leaving behind a shop full of people who had been touched by her quiet strength and professional competence. Detective Coleman shook his head in amazement. That young woman is going to go far in life. She already has, Jake said quietly. She's taught all of us more in 3 weeks than we learned in 15 years. As Jennifer and Michelle completed their course registration, they found themselves surrounded by other women interested in taking control of their personal safety. The conversation had evolved from individual fear to community empowerment, with Sarah's experience serving as both cautionary tale and inspiring example. Mrs. Peterson watched the growing group of women with satisfaction. Her husband's vision of a shop that truly served its community was finally being realized, thanks to a 19-year-old soldier who had refused to be dismissed or diminished. Outside, Sarah Martinez drove through the rain toward another situation where her training, judgment, and quiet strength would be needed. But now she left behind a place where other young women would be encouraged, trained, and respected as they took their own steps toward empowerment and self-reliance. The lesson that had begun with prejudice and assumption had evolved into something much more powerful, a community of people committed to supporting each other's right to safety, respect, and protection. And at the center of it all was the understanding that true strength often comes in small packages, and that the most important battles are sometimes fought not with weapons, but with dignity, knowledge, and the refusal to accept less than you deserve. 3 weeks had transformed not just Sarah's relationship with Peterson's gun shop, but the entire culture of respect and service that would benefit countless future customers who might otherwise have been dismissed based on their appearance rather than judged by their character and capabilities.